All right, assalamu alaikum, peace be with you. Welcome to Tarjuman. Tarjuman is a response to it's a response to the pervasive modern feeling of being cut off from our past traditions, cut off from each other, reality, and God. It is an attempt to recover the wisdom, insights, and feeling of connection with reality that we used to get from religion and that has been lost in the tumult of the last few centuries. The recovery of this is an act of rediscovery through creative thinking. I'm Matthew Abdul Haq Niami, Midwestern American nerd with a liberal but devout Protestant upbringing, full of music and science, and a postgraduate life full of Islam and humanities. And joining me today is Zevi Slavin, who's a scholar and practitioner of Jewish mysticism, hailing from Australia, but now based in Jerusalem. He runs the Seekers of Unity YouTube channel, which is full of fantastic content, whether you want to learn about the great thinkers of the history of mysticism, or if you want some inspiration for tackling the concerns of mysticism yourself. Thank you and welcome, Zevi.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you for having me here with you. I couldn't think of any better way to spend the evening.
Alhamdulillah, praise the Lord. I'm blessed to have you as my first guest, actually, on this channel. I'll be uploading it shortly as soon as I get some other things recorded and some of the all the little things that you realize you need to do as when you start doing something for the first time. I'm sure once I do those things, it'll be out within the week, God willing. So I've been, as I was mentioning before, I've been inspired much by your work, and I very much resonate with the mission of the Seekers of Unity, approaching religion from a way that takes spirituality very seriously, takes science very seriously, and tries to get past a lot of the identity games left over from the Middle Ages that we often get wrapped up in, and the branding and the anxiety and the deficit, or not the deficit, the scarcity mindset that sometimes clouds our judgment and clouds our wisdom, you could say. So I wanted to just, since this is an early episode, let's kind of talk a little bit about, I guess, what mysticism is, and we don't. I think we don't want to spend too much time on this, because I think once we give a couple examples, people will know what we're talking about without delving into the cognitive linguistics of, there are no boundaries between categories, and it's all about just the archetypes or whatever, But without going off into that rabbit hole, we'll just start with, what are some of the main things that you and other mystics, I guess, are concerned with? What are some of the type of the activities and the goals of mysticism that you see as the most kind of defining of what that is? Because it's not just magic, or sometimes people think mysticism just means magic or mysterious things. I guess I'm not sure what people I'm not sure what people think. So let me stop guessing and how would you see it?
I think it's a really great question for two reasons. Firstly, because it's a subject which is so often misunderstood and miscategorized in so many, even by people that are very well educated and otherwise very precise with their language. And that's one half of why it's an important question. The other half is because I think that what mysticism holds for the present moment is so much potential and richness that it's crucial, I think, to our very survival in some ways, to discover what it is and what it may mean for us. And in many ways, and this is perhaps, beginning to venture into what the word means, in many ways, it's the heart of religion. And if religion has anything of insight to tell us in the modern world, then a lot of what it has to tell us is going to be found in the core of, the furnace, the crucible of religion, which is in the mystical heart of religion, I believe. Mm-hmm. I think a good way of beginning to define a definition of mysticism, at least a working heuristic one, is, and there are many ways we can discuss what is mysticism linguistically and cognitively, and what are the genres of mysticism, the languages of mysticism. But I think a good way is to harken back to Plato, perhaps, the father in many ways of Western mysticism, who went on to inspire Jewish, Christian, and Muslim mystics. That mysticism is a realization that the world that we live in and our conception of that reality of the world that we're living in some sense is shadows. In some sense is not the real, is not the true reality. Plato's very famous allegory of the cave, that many people know in religious communities, whether or not they've read Plato, just because of how ubiquitous the Republic and Plato is, that in Plato's telling, there is the individual who leaves the cave and comes to discover the true reality out there. And for Plato, that is the forms, and without getting into the specifics of Platonism, but the basic sense that the reality that we encounter in our everyday life, there's something of a layer that needs to be peeled back in our own perception and cognition to discover the true reality that is there. And on that vein, one of my favorite, maybe not full definitions, but tagline for mysticisms comes from the great Christian scholar Evelyn Underhill. She wrote in her work early in the century titled Mysticism, which was a fantastic study of Christian mysticism. And she wrote there that mysticism is the art of union with reality. So as opposed to mysticism being seen as something which is escapist, that we're going to be doing these crazy rituals and practices to blow our brains out of the world and to be in some sort of other cosmic place, Underhill's definition, which I think ties in very nicely to Plato's, is that no, you're coming to discover what the truth of reality is in itself. The Sufis perhaps put this most beautifully when they talk about looking through the telescope of love, and it's on the other end of the telescope that you see reality as it is. And I think that the reality which the mystics, and we can speak more about what their goal is here, but I think what they intimate on the other end of that telescope of love is a reality which is in some sense, and there's many different articulations of this, but in some sense a reality which, as opposed to our everyday reality, which is separated, bifurcated, there's us and them, there's here and there, there's good and bad, everything is broken up, and the multiplicity of reality, the mystics somehow peer beyond the multiplicity and they see the fundamental unity that undergirds reality, the interconnectedness of all being, the interdependence of reality. And I think it's that drive towards unity, and the unity which is loving, and unity which is caring, and unity which is divine in some sense. I think that's where the mystics are. I think that's where they're hinting to us. So I think mysticism, in some sense, is a deconstruction of our ordinary ways of seeing reality, so that we can come to see it as it really is, which is somehow radically unified, interconnected, or one. I think on one foot that may be a good place to start, and you're welcome to push back, to add something, to subtract something, but I think that's maybe a good starting place.
Yeah. I actually, the kind of, the sort of working definition that I threw down, which is, different every day, but the one that I threw down today was that mysticism is the self-conscious attempt to get in touch with ultimate reality. And it's kind of funny because, if you look closely, you start to see mysticism happening almost in sciences of all sorts. I kind of see, at the root of it, mystics and scientists are very much engaged in the same project of trying to get at reality. It's just we call it mysticism because it uses a different set of tools and has maybe a little bit has developed a little bit of a different epistemology or what have you along the way. But I remember, all the time I'd be reading, I was reading like Anthropology of Religion, and the person, it was Catherine Bell. I remember, this is just one instance I remember of kind of experiencing this, is she was like really delving into the question of what is ritual. And granted, she's not approaching it as a practitioner of like, she's not stating it in terms of I'm going to unite with God or the ritual. She's approaching it as a social scientist, as an anthropologist. And so but in the discussion of breaking down, what do we mean when we're trying to define something? She's going into what it means to set a definition. She's really kind of getting into the nuts and bolts of reality and how our minds work and interact with that. And it was like a mystical experience as I was reading that. And so, I always get the sense that whatever you're doing, if you're taking it seriously, whatever field of study, or not even just study, but whatever you're trying to perfect, the longer you gaze into it, the more you'll start to see the layers of reality below that. If you look at Jung looking at Freudian stuff, he peered into it deeply enough until he started to see the cosmos, and I guess I don't know enough about Jung to really say if he saw God or anything. But he definitely started to see the cosmos and mythological things like deeper in there. It's the same with science. It's the same with different religions. I kind of see it as, if you look at I think there's one kind of mistake that modern people often make, and this is across fields, is like if there are disagreements about something, that means that any explanation goes. And you see this in the sort of breakdown of respect for experts in any sense, where it's like, maybe the experts have 4 major opinions that they debate among themselves, and they're based on the evidence, et cetera, et cetera. And so sometimes people will then be like, there's 4, even the experts disagree, so right. I can just take whatever I think, without any background in it, and my explanation is just as good as theirs. Right. And you find, but really, when you think of expert opinion, or you think of spirituality, or like things like beauty or what have you, they have this structure where there's no one way to build a good house, right? But there are plenty of ways to build a bad house. And the house is going to depend on what's the geography like, what's the materials you're using, what's the culture you're building it in, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to look different all over the place. But at the same time, at the end of the day, there's the question of, is the house going to collapse or not when next time there's a earthquake or whatever, or is the roof going to collapse and snow is just going to pour in, or depending on what your situation is. And so I kind of see that with I see mysticism as this blossoming of the depths of the reality blossoming up in whatever substrate, in whatever substance you're working with. Whether it's religion, science, athletic perfection, whatever it is. And granted, there are many of those fields that I couldn't talk about in detail because I'm a pedestrian about those fields, and so I haven't seen God in those fields. But of the fields that I'm somewhat familiar with, I see this cropping up. I see this kind of structure again of there's no one way to build a saint, but everyone recognizes a saint when you see it, and so we're just trying to figure out based on our own context how to do that, and a lot of our tools are old, and that doesn't mean they're stupid or something. The old stuff is not stupid or unsophisticated. It's just we have to retranslate it. We have to take into account new things we've learned, or just phrase it in ways that we can understand, whatever that process is. The conversation has to keep going. There's a verse of the Quran that says, it commands the prophet to say, if the sea were ink, and you've probably heard this one, if the sea were ink, it would run out before the words of my Lord ran out, even if you brought another sea as backup for it. Mm-hmm. And I think there's something analogous in the Talmud, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. But the idea that I get from that is that there's the book as in the Codex. There's the book of 114 chapters of the Quran, and there's the books of previous revelations. But the kitab, the scripture, in a sense, is infinite. It keeps on going. God never stops talking. As we're seeing the book of creation, more things are being revealed, and God is continuing to speak. And now I'm starting to sound like a United Church of Christ ad that, God is still speaking. But anyway, but yeah, so they're onto something there, and I endorse that message. Anyhow, so I want to hear a little bit about. Let's maybe talk a little bit about just kind of like how we as individuals maybe have come to mysticism. I'll speak a little bit about my kind of like gravitating toward it, and and then I'd like to hear if you relate to that or if you have a different story. But so I kind of came to Islam. I was 19. We all go through different phases and different journeys and what have you. So at that time, my brain was a bit different. My journey to Islam, I think, was in part motivated, for instance, by like a frustration with being exhorted to love someone who I didn't know, namely Jesus. That was one kind of frustration I had. And in the type of Islam that was very accessible online and what have you, and is very, has a lot of broadcast presence, is the sort of, the Salafis, which are kind of like the evangelicals of Islam, if you will. And they, so that type of Islam, and not that there's not good in it or whatever. There's plenty of good stuff in it. But I would maybe disagree with some of the things I'm saying now. So I experienced the type of Salafi or Protestantized type of Islam as more accessible, more kind of universal, more rational, less personal, more practical, and actually more true to the Bible than the Christianity I had been brought up in. And so I was initially kind of skeptical of Sufism. I came from that sort of Protestant, rationalized background where, I just didn't. It just seemed like weird stuff. I don't know. I kind of fell into that path of thinking, and then I remember saying that to one of my roommates when I was in Egypt, who was also a convert to Islam. And I was like, I'm kind of skeptical of Sufism. And he was like, well, that's because you're from Christian fundamentalist land. And that was stuck with me. And I think he was right. So now, as I've been maturing and stuff, I keep coming to find, for instance, that love of the Prophet Muhammad is actually heavily emphasized in many branches of Islam. And I find that the Sufis seem to just have a deeper understanding of so many aspects of the religion, even basic things like the Shahada, the testimony of faith, the basic creed, La ilaha illallah. The way the Salafis have it, it's like the whole important thing is that God is numerically one, and it's but then when you really delve into it, it's like why is it important that it's one? There was some, what am I? If there's am I a second being? Is that not a problem? Anyway. So, and just all these issues of theology and understanding, the nature of Tawheed, and the limits of reason, etc. Just seemed to be the Salafis' answers were just not satisfactory to me. And so I've just increasingly been picking up bits and pieces as I go to try to learn more about Sufism, until I, maybe a year ago or something, I picked up the book "What is Sufism" by Martin Lings, which is a fantastic book, by the way. So now I'm trying to just learn as much as I can. So is that how does that relate to your experience?
It's beautiful to hear everyone's journey, because our journeys are so exquisitely unique. And yet share so many core human components, and the conjunction of those two is always magnificent to see. I grew up in a practicing Hasidic community in Australia, and the Hasidism, for those that don't know, is the latest stage in some senses of Jewish mysticism. The Hasidic movement began as a revivalistic movement in Eastern Europe in the 1800s. Under the guidance of a mystic by the name of the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem, and continued on through his students and disciples and through various dynasties and lineages. And my family belongs to one of the communities of one of those lineages, those within the Hasidic world, or those that know something about it, this may be meaningful. It's the Chabad tradition within the Hasidic community, which is known for its philosophy and intellectualism. Each one kind of has its own flavor. Mm-hmm. So I got to mysticism because I was born into it in some sense. I was born into a practicing mystical community. And what that means in the actual community is an interesting question. And but I didn't know that such a thing as mysticism existed. I had Chassidut, I had the Torah, I had the teachings that I was raised on. But to me, there was no concept of a broader global or universal category of mysticism per se, and that I was doing a specific Jewish form of it. Only with time, as I became a teenager and I began reading, did I realize that what I was being taught in my heritage had a lineage to it, had a history to it, and that there were parallel traditions. And that discovery was a very, very interesting one, discovering that there were mystical traditions in other faiths, in Islam and Christianity, in the East as well. And I saw a tremendous amount of, automatically, like right away, I saw a tremendous amount of commonality and parallels between them. And it actually helped me understand my own tradition in profound ways that I had never understood before. Jewish mysticism is very complex and very ornate and very baroque and very, very elaborate. And somehow seeing the same ideas that I had been taught formalized in a different language allowed me to begin to understand them in new ways that I think that are true to the tradition itself, just never popped out at me, and that just set me off on a long chain and a long rabbit hole, which brings us to where we are today. And it's got me very, very interested in these questions of unity, and what does it mean to what does God mean, and what does it mean for the human to approximate and to imitate God and to be godly, and what might that mean for our world, and how has it intersected with philosophy. And I think the point you made earlier is very important, that a mystic is not in sort of some exclusive category of some hippie or some naked person living in a cave. The mystic is anyone who is pursuing their art to the nth degree, where they find reality hidden beneath it. And I think that reality, as far as we can tell, is one and is shared between people. So if we're discovering reality, we're discovering, whether we call it God or Brahman or whatever we're going to call it, Allah, I think it's ultimately the same reality we're coming to. And I think that the scientists doing their work is a mystic, and I think they're very clearly. I think Schrödinger, it would be very hard for anyone to argue that he wasn't. Einstein would be very hard to argue that these people weren't mystics in their own pronouncements of what they believed.
Right.
And I think that we have to, what you're doing rightfully so, is to say that this term mystic is not just a category for the past or for history or for religion. It's a term which is rightfully applied to anyone who is coming to these discoveries in their own variety of ways, and whether that's through the arts or the sciences or through sport or through so many ways. I think there are comedians who are uncovering this. I mean, there's no one way to get there. And so for me, that was my path. I had it thrust upon me, and then by some lucky chance, I discovered that it was a universal thing going on, not just my own tradition. And that's led me down this path of exploring what is this global story. And how can we actually carefully and respectfully bring traditions in conversation with one another and see their commonality without erasing differences, because that would be I think a sin. So how can we do that respectfully, and how can we do that with a grounded epistemology and metaphysics, and how can we do that in a way that's really rigorous and ethical? So that's my journey in very short.
Okay. Yeah, that's so I can't imagine, like, from my perspective, I find it hard to imagine growing up in a tradition founded on mysticism, like, and I think, at first I'd be like, whoa, that's amazing, and I'm sure it has a lot of amazing stuff about it, but at the other hand, I'm kind of like, well, we all kind of fantasize of a utopian, like, oh, if only my version of the religion were like the founding of a community. And then it's like, once you see, if maybe if the Baal Shem Tov or what have you saw your community, maybe he would be like, okay, this is great, that you're doing this and this and this. But I'm sure because of just human nature and just the nature of reality, it's obvious. I don't think it's utopia, right? It's I'm sure the Baal Shem Tov would be like, okay, you got this right, but this part you're kind of like, or there's people that are, falling into certain traps, whereas like the society that I come from falls into certain traps of maybe like nihilism or what was the other thing I was thinking of earlier today? Certain traps of like, or just like nihilism, or just certain maybe narrow types of rationality or what have you. Like, are there maybe different pitfalls that you see in a community founded on mysticism? If you would you like to speak to that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a tremendous amount of work that we all have to do, each individually and collectively, and I don't think that any of these communities are utopias. And
right.
To talk, I can talk personally in terms of sort of contemporary sociology a little, and then I can talk a little historically. Historians talk a lot about how with the founding of the Hasidic movement, there was a tremendous amount of idealism and passion and pathos and love, and it was a very radical movement in that sense. And historians talk about how within the first few generations already, things had become made into routine, and what was once a movement of spontaneity was now trying to get back to the spontaneity that once was, and had become institutionalized in courts and power structures. And this is a very well-known point in the academic historical study of, and I think this is true of any religion. I mean, look at any revivalist, right? They come with this burning vision. They come with their experience, and they're coming to try and create heaven on earth. And that passion, when it's genuine, I think does things in the world in positive ways, and sometimes negative ways. But very quickly we see the encrustment of human nature coming back, and the barnacles of our condition coming back, and sucking out of the life out of it was. And that's why throughout the history of the Bible and throughout human history, we see that it's the prophet who needs to come back generation after generation to bring us back to what was. So I think that's certainly true for the Hasidic community, and I think that there are generations of leaders and sages who try to bring us back to the beauty and simplicity and love of the Baal Shem Tov, and that's certainly the case.
Yeah,
I think what's very interesting growing up in a Hasidic community while sort of developing...
Well, sorry, before you go into that, I just wanted to say real quick, I'm glad you said about how, it does do things in the world, because I think the temptation sometimes is to be like, okay, well, we can't found utopia, so why even try, to some extent. And I like to remind myself that, no, the big, huge, there were movements in the past that changed things for the good. They're not perfect, but they're we can't, the eternal struggle against evil. If you give up on it, then evil's going to win. So,
I firmly believe in what you're saying, and I think that while we may never reach utopia. I mean, utopia is kind of a joke. If anyone knows the etymology, it's utopos. It's the non-place, the place that never will be. But I think that the second that we stop trying to reach it, is a surrender, right? And I think that that's really important. I mean, one of the core beliefs in Judaism is the belief in the Messianic age and Messianic redemption. And there's a lot of very sophisticated Jewish philosophy, ancient, medieval, and modern, saying how like the Messiah may never even come. This is a voice which already appears in the Talmud, and a voice that comes up again throughout Jewish history. But the belief in the necessity of humans to try to rectify the world and to rectify the divine is never something that we're allowed to let go of. It's the belief in it which makes life worth living in some sense, and I think that's an important point to say, and it's also important to say that utopias can be very dangerous, and we know that from history too, but as with all things that have power, they can be used for the good and the bad. Growing up in a Hasidic community was very interesting, particularly as I began to sort of wake up to philosophical questions and ways of thinking about reality that way. The community has the theology of the community is radically mystical, and it's not hidden beneath the surface. It's apparent. If you ask a Hasidic Jew, even someone who's not particularly philosophically or theologically literate or interested, you ask them about the nature of God, they'll tell you right away all of the slogans that go back to the beginning of the Hasidic movement and earlier. For example, Ein od milvado, there is nothing but God, right? And so, or that the world itself doesn't really exist in compared to the reality of God. This is, a basic theological tenet. It's basically an acosmism. It's a pantheistic or panentheistic acosmism that the contemporary Hasidic Jew believes. But I think because those categories are so foreign and have so much dissonance with just the practical ways we live our lives in, late stage neoliberal capitalism, that those categories, there's real dissonance there, and I don't know how much. There certainly are individuals and families and groups that do stop and do let those realities drop in on them and say, if nothing exists but God and everything is God, then how can I be living my life the way that I am? And if my reality is in some sense an illusion, what is the true reality? I think these are questions that are asked, but I think by and large, because these things are so challenging, they become normalized like everything else, and they become slogans, and they lose their power to impact the person. There's a very beautiful Hasidic parable. A lot of Hasidism was conveyed in story, not just in philosophy. And they say a story of a fellow who's riding somewhere in a horse and wagon, and he's riding. He's surrounded by barrels of alcohol. I hope this is not an offensive parable for the Muslim audience. And he's very surprised. He's very surprised. It's the Russian winter. He's very surprised that he's cold, because he knows that if he drinks the alcohol, he'll become very warm. And he thinks that all the alcohol around him should be keeping him warm. They should be radiating heat. And the Hasidic punchline is that you have to actually imbibe that which is surrounding you. You can't just be surrounded by the truths of the mystics or the poetry. You have to actually take it in and make it. You have to internalize it. You have to taste it, and only then does it have its power upon you. And I think that part of the calling of anyone growing up in a community that has these messages is to actually go and begin to drink from those wells. And allow ourselves to be, if I can extend the metaphor, allow ourselves to be intoxicated by them and to see reality afresh through their perspectives.
Yeah, that's very, 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 very relatable, and I appreciate you sharing that. The a lot of times in the Western, or I guess whatever, in the current context, people. Like Muslims often get very excited by people who are not from a traditionally Muslim background converting, and they think like, oh, this must be a really holy person that like God has chosen, et cetera, et cetera. And I always try to remind people like, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Like even people born into the Islamic tradition, like they have to at some point choose to really embrace it. Me being, there's probably some benefit in cognitively in the sense of like switching traditions and kind of like shaking everything up for a bit in your mind. But like, does that, that doesn't mean that that's the really like valuable category for who's the most spiritually enlightened or what have you. Because I'm sure there's plenty of people who convert because of marriage, or they convert because of their astrology chart that day like told them to do something, and they saw something in the clouds, and they would have decided to become Muslim that day, and they haven't really thought through any of this stuff. You know what I'm saying? Like there's all sorts of reasons people convert, and that's not what makes that's not what makes somebody, I guess, spiritually really imbibing something. I can definitely relate to some of those dynamics. Okay, so I want to hear a little bit more. This is something I struggle with based on my own, brain chemistry or what have you. But when you talk about the lens of love into reality, can you maybe translate that into a different idiom or something? Because that's one of those things that just like, I don't know, it doesn't click with me in my post-enlightenment brain.
Sure. No, it's important. I think it's important to be able to formulate things in different ways, and sometimes it's a poetic formulation that's needed, and sometimes it's a scientific, sometimes it's a historical, sometimes it's a metaphysical. And I appreciate you asking me to put it differently. I think that love is a very large subject, and there's been a lot of ink spilled about love. But I think that if we can, in the context that I was trying to, and I think that in some ways that the mystics are using it, is that what happens in love, and you tell me if this resonates with you or not, or if I can try a different way, is that we cease to, there's a mode of being, let's say, where I'm the center of the universe, inevitably, you know, that I'm the point from which everything happens, and in some sense why everything happens, and my objective is to thrive and survive and to increase my own pleasure and reduce my own pain. This is like a very basic, you know, evolutionarily biological accurate description of reality, and very often we default into living our lives that way. That's one mode of reality, and things that we encounter in our lives we see as instruments to our own embetterment, empowerment, our own pleasure, and that's a general way, and it has its perks, you know, it has its usages, but there's another way, there's another mode of being when we encounter something, and the thing which we encounter, we don't feel it to be alien from ourselves, and therefore we don't feel that we can exploit it for our gain because it's really other than us, and we feel like somehow its prospering and its happiness is as important to us as our own. You're from what I gather, you're a father, right?
Yes.
I'm assuming that when you first held your newborn child, the sense that this child's well-being and happiness and pain is your own, and like the thought that you would do something to take advantage or to do something that would put you ahead of the child, like have your child, seems like a non sequitur, and I think that's what love is. Love means that our boundaries of identity have somehow become permeable, and there's an osmosis of identities where that becomes part of us, and that love can extend to an individual, to a family member, to a clan, to a community. It can also extend to the world at large, and I think what the mystics are saying is that when we see the world at large as divine, as not other than us, as inherently somehow part of the self or part of the great nothingness, if we're going to talk in the Buddhist language, then my happiness and my success cannot be separated from the happiness of everything that I'm encountering, and I must be committed to seeing that thing flourish as much as I would like to flourish, and we radically change our perspective, and I think that having a perspective of ourselves in our own private existence and survival only takes us so far, and ultimately doesn't bring us happiness because we're stuck within our own bubble, and we create our own, you know, needs which turn into greeds, and filling that as an endless pit. And when we can shift our perspective and I think and see the world through the lenses of love, we're now living in a different state of being. And I don't mean to be preaching from a high soapbox here and say that like I'm in a loving mode of being all the time. There are mornings where I'm in a miserable mood and I can get cut off in traffic and I can lose my temper. Yeah. But ideally, we're talking about ideals here. We're talking about what are we striving towards? I'm striving towards living in a state of love, living in a state where all that I encounter, the stranger, the friend, the tree, the bird, the cat, my neighboring Muslim, my neighboring Jew, that their happiness and their existence is as central to me as my own in some sense. And I think that's what the mystics are talking about. And it's not just a philosophical abstraction. I think what they're saying, they're talking about an actual real lived experience. And the reason why love is a powerful one is because I think love is perhaps one of the most common human experiences which approximates or points to the mystical. And I think there are others. I think music does that. I think now psychedelics is doing that. I think sports in some sense in the shared identity. But I think love is when I speak to high school students and I try to explain to them what mysticism is, and it's a stage in life where they're beginning to have crushes and there are people they're interested in and all kinds of fun things. And I say that feeling of when you hold someone and you really feel like you're really melting into them and you really care for them as much as you care for yourself. That is what the mystical is, and that feeling you can, according to the mystics, feel that all the time for all of existence, for all of reality, and that's what and if we can do a reading here, I think it's not a reading which is foreign to the mystics themselves. I think that is a state of bliss, a state of paradise. That is the beatific vision. I think that is what the mystics are talking about when they're rereading their own traditions.
Okay, yeah,
I hope that was a helpful
that's very
reframing.
helpful. Yeah, that was very helpful, actually. Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's definitely very helpful. Yeah, because again, my brain, the word love is, again, it needs to be translated.
Sure.
Because at least my brain, and I think other people this happens as well. We just think of like, the crush that the crush feeling that you experience as a kid, which, not that that's not part of it, I guess, but, or like infatuation, you think of infatuation, you think of rom-com stories, you think of, and then you see Hallmark cards, which are just, kind of just like marketing the stuff, and so you kind of, at least my, sort of my cynical kind of slightly traditionalist and arrogant type of mind goes, what is this BS? Like, so that's very helpful. I appreciate you. That's helpful for sending me in the right direction, I think. Yeah, that was thank you for sharing that explanation of love. I think my post-enlightenment science trained brain needed that. So this kind of touches a little bit on, what I had shared with you in email about initially thinking about talking about the a personal God versus a impersonal God, I guess, for lack of a more descriptive term. And the personal aspects of God are the ones that really are the biggest struggle or the biggest obstacle, I think, to people like me, and anyone kind of trained in modern Western education systems. And one thing I'll share, maybe an aspect or something I'm kind of discovering with regard to that, which it may sound very. This is the funny thing. Again, it sounds very almost atheistic. What I'll say, perhaps, but again, I have faith that if you gaze deeply enough into it, you'll begin to see God again. And this is an example of that, where so I was kind of to take the left brain or whatever dichotomy you want to use, the rationalist lens on these kind of things, and sort of really push it to its limits. One of the things I'm coming across is that when we think about consciousness, we wonder what that is, right? It seems kind of paradoxical, or it seems very difficult to relate it to, I guess, physical reality or scientific reality or mathematical reality or what have you. But one kind of trajectory that I'm finding promising is kind of like information theory, kind of like discussing matters of complexity, patterns, etc. And one theory that I heard recently, which sounded very valuable, is thinking of you can think of consciousness, or let's talk about randomness, actually. So we typically think of randomness as very purposeless, very. We think of randomness as the opposite of theistic thought, right? We tend to think of it as like, if we talk about the randomness of the universe, that's like atheist stuff, right? But what I heard recently was that you can think of two extremes. One extreme being a pattern, a very simple pattern, A-B pattern that repeats on forever, or like 1 divided by 3 is 0.3333333333. Not interesting, right? It's very predictable. You can reduce it to a simple equation or whatever. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you have things like a gas in a balloon. Very complicated. The molecules are moving randomly. You cannot predict it. But at the same time, that randomness almost kind of washes out to nothing interesting again, right? So all the interesting stuff happens somewhere in the middle, of like a balance of those two. And it gives me the sense that perhaps, maybe true randomness is actually is so unpredictable that you can't even predict it to be unpredictable. Like, so there's experiments, where they have people try to guess coin tosses, and they'll purposely, self-consciously try to be like, oh, well, I shouldn't have a lot of heads in a row, but actually, when you actually do it, you very frequently will end up with 5, 6 in a row of the same thing, so it's like these things that look like patterns. Well, true randomness has no aversion to patterns, and so that's where complexity arises, in this place right in the middle, or near the middle, you could say, of those two extremes, where you can get patterns on patterns on patterns, on randomness on randomness, on patterns on randomness, and that's where all the interesting stuff happens. And consciousness is maybe like, if the middle point is what we call randomness, maybe consciousness is like right here, slightly more random than that, or something. Where, or maybe that's difficult to characterize. But I guess I'm starting to see a very close connection between what we call randomness and what we call consciousness. Because conscious beings, they're predictable in some ways, but they're very unpredictable ultimately in other ways. And so, like, what, that makes me think of, what we call randomness. Can we understand that as, the endless creativity of God? Something like that. That's kind of where I'm going, with some of this very mathematical type of thinking. And yeah, have you encountered anything like that, or what do you think of that?
I actually love this. I'm always fascinated to find parallels between disciplines, particularly between metaphysics and theology and the sciences, mathematics. I think it's such a beautiful, to me it's almost artistic, like making those comparisons. There's something poetic and musical about them, to triangulate to another discipline, and I feel like very, very often they're being done by people that are just selling snake oil and charlatans, and they bring a lot of disrepute to these endeavors. But I think there's so much beauty to be found in deep resonances and comparisons between the sciences, between the mathematics specifically, and theology and metaphysics. What you're gesturing at now, and it reaches the deepest reaches, or the deepest sort of reaches that the human mind is capable of, and bringing the deepest reaches from various fields to be talking with one another. And there has been a lot of interesting work on that. I mean, there was a famous relationship between Krishnamurti and David Bohm, who was a quantum theorist, and Krishnamurti was a Hindu mystic, and things that came out of their relationship and conversation were just really profoundly rich, interactions and overlaps and shared ways. Because if we do believe, like we were saying before, that there is some sort of reality at the core, then we can approach that through our mediums. We can approach that, as we were saying, through art and through music and through science and through mathematics and through theology, and I think part of this project is to say that the people who are saying that theology should not be part of that conversation because it's just an outdated science don't really understand either theology or the human condition, and I think where we share that. I unfortunately don't have a great strength in science, and I try to be humble in fields where I don't have a strength, and I don't like to I don't like to talk about the quantum physics of mysticism because I'm not a quantum theorist, and I think a lot of people that talk about these things, there are some people that are doing it well and intelligently, but some 90-something% don't know anything about quantum physics, and they probably don't know anything about physics either, and they probably shouldn't be speaking about it.
Right.
But I think that the questions in mathematics of infinity, the questions that are trying to be answered in calculus, I think these are questions they're metaphysical questions, and it's very clear that the mathematicians and the scientists doing that are aware of it, right, at the highest level, and it's rare to find the mathematicians at the highest level of these abstraction that are doing it in some sort of purely nihilistic, nominalistic, sort of meaningless way. More often, people that we mentioned before, like Einstein and Schrödinger. Einstein writes a book, What is Life? And he goes into wax poetic about his metaphysical speculations. It's people at the highest reaches that are doing this, and they're self-aware that what they're doing that when you're doing mathematics at that level or doing science at that level, what you're doing is metaphysics. Like, it's not, what you're doing is mysticism, even if we're going to be more specific in the language. I think, I'm curious, are you relating the question of chaos and order to the question of a divine personality versus an impersonal divinity? Were you drawing that parallel explicitly? Because that's an interesting direction to pursue.
Basically, I guess the question is, like, if the mystics throughout history have obviously pointed to a personal God, a God that has person-like qualities, and I guess while I can my brain is it's relatively easy for me to see kind of the impersonal qualities of the divine. It's more difficult for my brain to see the personal qualities, and while I am ignorant about it, I still I think it's unlikely that all these other people are talking about nothing, or they're using those terms in a very unuseful way. Since I've found mystics to be very, in my experience, I went from initially thinking, oh, that's weird stuff, I don't know what they're talking about, to being like, wow, these guys really, or girls, really know what they're talking. They're really getting to the core of the matter, and they're really, the most practical religionists. They're taking it the most seriously. They're saying, don't tell me that. Oh yeah, I'll find out it's all true at the end after I die. Right. They're saying, where is it right now?
Right. Right.
And so that, I guess, that drives me in part to say that's one of the reasons, I guess, I want to learn more how to understand that personal description of God and how that can make sense. And I guess from my perspective, it's difficult to see person-like qualities in the way we understand the physical universe. But there's a quote. Actually, from that book, What is Sufism? There's a quick quote of this Sheikh Al-Arabi Al-Darqawi, who says, and this really stuck out to me. He was like praying one day, and he wrote this in his letters, that he was reciting the verse, or the verse came to his mind that the Quranic verse saying that God is the first and the last, the inner and the outer, like the inner hidden reality and also the outer apparent reality, and so he goes on to say, at first I didn't pay attention, but and I continued my dhikr, my remembrance, but it wouldn't leave me alone. That verse kept coming back and bothering his mind, and he said, as to his saying that he is the first and the last and the inward, I understand that part. So like the hidden reality, the first and the last, that part I understand. But as far as saying he's the outward, I do not understand it. For we see nothing but outward, so nothing outward but created things. Then the voice said to me, this is the Sheikh speaking, if by his words, if by calling himself the outward, this is it's translated from Arabic, so it sounds very awkward in English. But yeah, so he's if by his words calling himself the outward, if he meant anything, then the outward that we are seeing, that would be the inward, not the outward. Like if he's saying that he's the apparent, but you're saying it's not this apparent that you're seeing, like what else would he be talking about except for this outer reality?
Right.
And so then he said, that would be inward, not outward. So, but I tell thee, and the outward, well, dhahr, in the Arabic, and he is the outward. And so I realized that there is no being but God, nor anything in the worlds of the universe save him alone. Praise and thanks be to God.
Right.
So like realizing that the outer realities are also an unfolding of God's nature.
Yeah.
And so what else would that mean? How do we reconcile those two, I guess?
Yeah.
And so yeah, that presented a challenge to me, and so I guess basically this is where I'm starting to see it is because kind of getting down to like, well, what do we mean by a person? What do we when we say we encounter consciousness? How are we experiencing that? Because I think we tend to just be like, oh well, I I feel that there's a consciousness, or we just intuit it, right? We intuit that we are facing a consciousness. And like when you and it's that, and I think what it is, the way we can detect consciousness is this kind of like combination of order and chaos in a way, or the way that order and chaos kind of like perpetuate. Because again, like in the gas, if you look at a balloon of gas or whatever, the gases are, patterns certainly arise in the gas sporadically because it's random, but there's nothing really for them to perpetuate on. Maybe the molecules will line up for a second, but the next second it'll be gone.
Right.
There's nothing for that pattern to like catch on. Whereas in like the formation of life, for instance, it's like you could think of it as the pattern of gravity perpetuates. It's causes the mass. The mass gravity dynamic creates a pattern which perpetuates and then causes a type of regularity for new patterns to arise on top of that. Right. But at every and there's sort of like patterns on patterns on patterns. But at every level, you're seeing randomness as well. You see the diversification of life. You see all these different things. So it's kind of like true randomness is probably kind of an ideal that we don't really see in this world, because it's always mediated through types of matter, which will there's always a patternedness to the way matter moves to some extent, because of just it is what it is. Photons act the way they act, molecules act the way they act, and so there's some level of predictability to it. So you don't ever see true randomness, but there are kind of like you see degrees of it, and so that's where I'm going, is what do we mean by a person or a consciousness, and do we see that in the universe? That's I guess basically where I'm going.
This is a fascinating question and a fascinating direction, and I like this sort of, you've triangulated three issues here, which is personhood, externality, and order. And you put them into conversation with one another, which is interesting. I think there's a lot to unpack here. Maybe, and I don't know if we can do justice to any of this, but maybe we'll open up some avenues of thought, which will be beneficial for us and for others, hopefully as well. The point of
for sure,
the point of order and disorder. The question of the inner and outer is an interesting one, and maybe we'll start there. And that was I appreciate you sharing that verse, very beautiful one. And there's a very almost pragmatic, no nonsense response there in the verse where he questions whether God can be really the outer, because the outer is the created, and typically we distinguish between the creator and the created, and the response that he is that if you're perceiving it, then it is outer. If you're not perceiving it, it's not outer. It's this callback to common sense definitions. Which is quite refreshing. There's an interesting play here between this innerness and outerness, and it's something which mystics have played with. I think someone who's not recognized as being a mystic but plays with this quite interestingly is what's his name in Finian's Wake is James Joyce. I think he plays with this quite interestingly, but to go back to how we began our definition of mysticism, which is that the Platonic notion that what's happening in the cave isn't real in some sense. It's the shadows, it's the outer. It's the zahir as opposed to the batin, as you would have it in Arabic. We share that as an opening statement, but it's really not true, and it's not the truth of mysticism. I think it's the opening gambit of mysticism. I think mysticism begins with
the first phrase in the dialectic.
Yes.
Statement in the dialectic.
Yeah. So now we've got a bit beyond that. We've got a bit beyond opening definitions. I think mysticism and religion in general begins by denying reality as we think we know it. What you see is not true. That really
seeing the contradictions in what we see,
yes,
and realizing that
yes.
there must be something below it. Yeah,
something below or above or whatever the metaphor is. Right.
Yes.
And religion in general is gonna be telling us things that we wouldn't otherwise necessarily know, and science may disagree. So religion will say that in addition to the body, which you can perceive with your senses, you also have something which is non-sensual, which is the soul, for example. And that's kind of the ground, that's the starting point, I think, of religious traditions and of mysticism as well, where it's like you think that you live in a world of multiplicity and time and later and earlier and here and there and spatiality, but really these things are just the categories of your perception, and they're not real in some sense, to use a Kantian phrase. I think mysticism begins there, but I don't think that's where it ends. I think mysticism comes to a place where it affirms that the outer is also God. And the outer means the phenomenal, right? So if we're going to distinguish between the noumena and the phenomena, between the thing as it is in itself, in Kant's language, and that which it appears to us, and then the first step would be to say, we want to get to the noumenon, we want to get to the real reality, we want to get to the core of reality itself, and we want to get beyond the mere phenomenal. There's a very famous Eastern saying that before I began to practice Zen, mountains were mountains and rivers were rivers. And then as I began to practice and sit, mountains were no longer mountains and rivers were no longer rivers. I deconstructed my categories of being. I engaged with reality in fundamentally new modes of being, through whether that's through radical Buddhist metaphysics of deconstruction, or whether that's through the Sufis' power of love, or whether that's through the Kabbalistic engagement with whichever tradition, in whatever way they're doing it. Reality is now no longer what it was. But then the end of that line is that when I continued, or I culminated in my practice of Zen, mountains were again mountains and rivers were again rivers. That we've come back to the phenomenal and seen the divine in the phenomenal. That we come back to the shadows and see that the shadows themselves are part of the divine reality. They're not other than it, because there's nothing. It's the external too. And I think I think the same play is happening in the personal and impersonal, where, like, we're taught as kids that God is a person, typically a male person, with some big white beard, and that God's going to get upset and reward us and punish us. It's a very anthropomorphic, very basic, very childlike, a very projected image of God. And what what theology does as one matures theologically, what the mystics do is, like, they're like, no, God doesn't have a body, and God doesn't have emotions. These are metaphors. These are figures of speech. God is a principle. God is the one. God is goodness itself. God is being. And we deconstruct that, and we remove personality, and we turn God into a principle. But I think that the mystics don't stop there, and I think that the mystics come back to bring personality. They don't just leave us in the chaos. They bring order back. And when you continue reading the mystics and getting beyond sort of the pop versions of mysticism, you find the mystics reaffirming a personality in the depths of God, which is deeper than the non-personality of God. And you see this play out. You see this played out across traditions. You see this played out in Hinduism, in the complex relationships between Brahman and Ishvara. Rudolf Otto wrote a great work documenting that, comparing that to the dialectics between, in Meister Eckhart, one of the greatest philosophical Christian mystics, between God with personhood as part of the triune Godhead of the Trinity, and then God, the Unger and the grounded being itself, and then coming back to God as person to sort of redeem that. And I think part of, and the Kabbalists as well did the same. The Kabbalists have this term for God, which they call Ein Sof, the infinite, the Apeiron, the Lanihia, that which has no limit, and there's no personality there. But then when you read them a bit deeper and a bit more carefully, you see that even in this Ein Sof, even in this nothingness, they call God nothingness. They call God Ayin, much like Mahayana Buddhists will call reality like shunyata, just pure emptiness. Very, very similar terms, and those comparisons have been studied and made. But then they'll say that even in this Ein Sof, even in this nothingness, there's still something of there is personhood and personality. And I think what perhaps they're saying there is that we clearly experience something that we conceptualize as personality. We experience that in ourselves. And because that exists, even in our own experience, right? The outer exists because, and it's that which we see, which is the outer. Therefore, it must exist within the divine, because the divine is the totality of reality. And then the question just is, right, so once we've established that the personhood exists at all, we must say that there is personhood in the divine, because everything that exists is in the divine, right? Then the question just becomes what is what is the truer face of the divine? Is it a face of nothingness, or is it a face of with shape, with order, that we see patterns, or are we projecting patterns where there is no patterns? Are we seeing faces where there are no faces, right? Which is a very common human cognitive and perceptual fallacy.
Right.
When we get down to, and I'm glad that we've opened up this conversation and opened up and brought some of the traditions into it, but just to kind of give a summation to this, I think in my own, where I am now in my own phase, my own stage, and this changes all the time because life and faith is a living and changing thing. I had this conversation a while back actually with another Muslim brother over at my channel. His name was Ihsan. And we had a very beautiful conversation, and I had turned to him with this question. He shared me a very beautiful teaching, and something which I've seen as well amongst Jewish teachers, and I feel very blessed to have teachers of wisdom and faith from all traditions to bring that grand harmony and the chorus of wisdom together. What he said was that it's hubristic to think that we'll ever discover the fundamental nature of reality, right? Is God personal? Is God not personal? What is the actual relationship between order and chaos? And what he said was that we have to have some humility and sometimes perhaps ask a different question, which is that in this moment of life, in this moment right now where I am, how do I want to be relating to reality as it is, and how will that increase care and love in the world? Am I trying to enter into a prayer, and do I need something personal to relate to in this moment? Am I trying to meditate metaphysically, and do I need to be thinking? Do I need to be stripping myself? Do I need to engage in a bit of? There's a beautiful Jewish mystic, Rav Kook, Abraham Isaac Kook, who said that atheism is part of the process of mysticism because it purifies us from our own theism that needs sometimes to be cleaned up. So the question perhaps is, and maybe people feel like this is a bit weak, but I think that we're not philosophers. We're humans first, and we're asking philosophical questions. But as humans, we need to. There are constructs which can help us in the moment, and there are constructs which can be destructive. And maybe I'm less of a purist about like there is the truth, and therefore we can discover the truth. I think that there are answers that can work for us in these moments, and maybe more of a Jamesian truth of what is the profit of these truths for me now. And I think that it's maybe hard to swallow because as a teenager, I wanted the truth. Is God a person or is God not a person? And to me, it's like, in this moment, right now, for what I'm doing, for what I'm called to do in this moment, how do I need to be relating to reality as it is? Do I need to be relating to reality as governed by a monarchical figure who has set laws, and those laws must be governed whether we like them or not? Or do I need to be relating to reality as a pervasive love that binds us all, or something else? And I think there's a humility and a fluidity in that. That's my 2 cents.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I'll definitely have to chew on that and try to see if I can get that to work in my head.
Yeah, I remember the first time someone suggested this, it didn't work at all for me, and I didn't like them for saying it. And
no, I didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, Allahu Alam. God only knows when it will work, or how will we be guided, or if we will be guided, or what have you. So, well, I know we're it's been an honor and a pleasure talking to you, and I know we're I'm sure we could talk for hours, especially if given the right caffeine amounts or what have you. I'm sure we could go for hours and hours, but we'll have to wrap it up for today, I think, and let you settle in for the evening, and me continue the rest of my day here in the Chicago area. But it's been a great honor and a pleasure talking with you. Thanks so much, and I hope we can talk again. And if you wanted to plug anything that you're doing right now, or where can we, obviously the Secrets of Unity, is there anything in specific you want to draw people's attention to? Firstly, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honor, and I feel blessed to be in conversation and community with people like yourself, and may it only increase. My work can be found on YouTube. Seekers of Unity is where it's at.
Maybe I'm not sure who your audience is. If you're attracting a Muslim audience, we did a series on Sufism and Jewish mysticism, looking at historical relationships, conceptual relationships, interviews with experts and practitioners, and I hope that will be a rich resource for as a bridge between the Muslim and Jewish community, to meet at the point of the heart. And I hope that I hope that these conversations move us and move people, and that we can begin to change the discourse that happens. Because the discourse sure needs a lot of shifting, and I thank you for inviting me to partake in that.
Alhamdulillah, just doing what I can. So.